Thank you everyone for joining us today for the next iteration of our Raising Ambition Through Partnership webinar series from the NDC Partnership. My name is Sarah Hertel and I'm the NDC Enhancement Knowledge Specialist with the NDC Partnership Support Unit, and excited to be here today for our webinar on the updated 2024 NDC Handover Checklist. And before we get started, just want to highlight a few logistical and housekeeping pieces. First, we are pleased to offer interpretation in Spanish and French for this session. So if you would like to listen to the webinar in a language other than the default language of English, please follow the instructions on the screen, and I will also say them here and put them in the chat. At the bottom of the Zoom window, you can click on the icon that looks like a globe to access the interpretation settings. And once you click on that icon, a pop-up window will appear that shows the available languages for interpretation. You can then select your preferred language from the list, so either French or Spanish. And then to make sure that you can hear the audio more clearly, you can click the mute original audio option so that you don't have the overlapping sound. And I will again put those instructions in the chat for everyone. And a few quick housekeeping pieces. We do have both a chat and question and answer function available in this webinar. So we hope that you will use the chat feature throughout the sessions to share comments, resources, engage with other participants, and also introduce yourself and share what organization and/or country you are joining from. But I encourage you to use the question and answer function for any questions that you have for the panelists so that we can keep track of them and so that we're able to answer as many as possible. So you can find both of those, the chat and the question and answer functions on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and please use them throughout the session. The presentation slides and also the recording here will be available to you after the webinar. We will upload it to the NDC Partnership YouTube channel, and we'll share a final email with all participants that will include the recording and the slides. So by participating in this session, you consent to being recorded here. And with that, we have the end of our housekeeping notes. But to kick us off, we have just a few objectives of what the Raising Ambition Through Partnership webinar series is, which is essentially to highlight successful examples of mitigation and adaptation ambition raising efforts around our partnership members. And today we'll be talking about the updated NDC Handover Checklist and providing practical guidance on how governments and stakeholders can utilize this checklist to enhance institutional memory and knowledge transfer, and then also discuss how the checklist can contribute to broader climate policy processes. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Jan.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the occasion and joining us. I'm Jan Sint, head of the Implementation Strategies team for Climate Analytics, and I would like to give you a brief kind of setting the scene piece, or a little bit of an overview, why we would like to promote, what I would say is promote actually, the handover checklist. We've been working on it. I save you the details. You get the slides later if you want. We've been working on NDCs as climate analytics since 2015. And that includes, for some countries, 2 or even 3 rounds now, and found a few issues around data mainly and consistency of NDCs really, which spurred the idea of developing this little tool, if you want to call it that. It's probably more like you want to get the idea than to actually necessarily use the exact tool that we have developed, I guess, even though I recommend using a similar approach. But in general, what we are trying to achieve is get a more streamlined approach to data, to modeling, and also to the consistency of NDCs over time. So let's maybe start with a little bit of an overview how this developed. We have the issue with the 5-year NDC cycles, as you all know. it's not a lot of time in between, but it's enough that people working at a certain place have been involved and left since. So this 5-year cycle may mean that in the 5 years in between, whatever has been used to inform the last NDC's target might actually be lost to history. And that means for the next round, you have to start reverse engineer that initial target in order to provide a consistent NDC ambition raising process, as well as, of course, the necessary clarity that you might want about how this target has been set and defined. And that means also that this continuous process has in the past sometimes led to NDC targets that have been very robust in terms of how to achieve them and in terms of how to understand them if there has been a continuity of assumptions used. Let's take the example of an NDC using a business as usual background scenario for the target. Within these 5 years, your business as usual most often changes. So you're actually no longer looking at the same baseline, and then you need to adjust your target. But if you do no longer know what informed that original business of usual, and you just create a new one based on your economic outlook at the moment, it's not going to fit to the old target and will be difficult or impossible to compare. So that's basically the rationale. And of course, while we want to see progression over time towards net zero, it is often very difficult for countries to show that progression also without having an understanding of how the data that informed the old target has changed over time, because you have two things that change then, a new target and a new baseline. How would you compare the ambition? It's basically impossible if you see two different numbers next to each other that do not relate at any point in time. And then, of course, there's the other problem of aligning with your long-term strategies. Because I mean, at some point, we want to reach net zero, and the NDCs should, in pieces, in small bites of 5 years, take us there. But if we don't have targets in the NDCs that we can track over time and compare really with what we are aiming for in the future, because these two are using different methods and data assumptions, and we don't know which they are, we have in the end the same kind of problem that we will not be able to understand how far we have progressed towards meeting a certain target or how far we have progressed towards aligning with the LTS. So basically the rationale is data consistency. It's not more than that. And there are many ways to achieve that, but what we are going to present you today is going to be a very simple way to achieve it. It tracks basically the limited background information that we have, and then tries to compile it into a document that would help us understand how an NDC target has been designed, who has been involved, which gases have been covered, which models have been used, what was the baseline for the targets, if you have a base year or kind of a baseline scenario as business as usual. And then also about all of the decision-making that have been informing that target, who's been involved in that and similar. This would also include, usually, if you want to take it a bit further, your additional resources that you needed to fill gaps. So you can think about what type of data would I need to collect over the next 3 to 4 years to add a sector or a gas in the next NDC. But you can only do that if you know what's been missing in the last. Then also what might have caused delays in the NDC process. In my case, mostly it would have been a lack of data. And then, of course, sometimes it's also about stakeholder coordination mechanisms not in place that can cause delays, or access to funding for support. And then finally, also useful to have added in that circumstance, if you want it anyways, is kind of a list of challenges that you faced for discussion around sectors and adjustments in that last NDC, because then you can think about how to address those for the next. Then we would like to see tracking of external support, especially because it's useful to understand who can be reached out to if something hasn't been clear in the overview of this stock take exercise. So if something hasn't been tracked properly, we can still ask, hopefully, the equivalent of me having done the last NDC, what I've done there. And that is also important because we sometimes see a number of different partners engaged in any circumstance in the NDC process. So you would often have the likes of FAO or IRENA alongside us doing other sectors in kind of the target modeling. And finally, a problem that we need to solve, and which is also easier to solve if we have this tracked, is, of course, as I mentioned, the staff turnover, not only in state agencies, but also, of course, with implementing partners. So not many of the people I've been working with in 2015 are still working with me on NDC revision. And not many in the ministries I've been working with would still be working with that now. And this is a problem because many state organizations do not track the kind of connections people had in the past, or do not track even who has been working on what in the last NDC process outside of the actual focal point. So this all led us to think about what we could do, and resulted in the NDC Handover Checklist as a final product. We do have a few separate purposes then, of course, which this can be used for. So first of all, of course, to record essential information about the process itself, the resources used, the decisions made, the actors. Then, of course, to document kind of reflections and recommendations to improve the process over time. And then also to contribute to other processes, because much of the information needed for the NDC data side, so all of the modeling work, and all of the transparency requirements for the NDC would also be needed in the other transparency framework reporting pieces, which there are very many from now. And then finally, of course, as I mentioned, for the long-term strategies. Yeah, the background is probably not that important, but as I mentioned, this has been developed after the second round, so in 2020, 2021, because that was when we figured out that there's actually a gap in data consistency, and also sometimes impossible to find out what the last organization has actually done for arriving at the model. We wanted to have something that is very simple for that reason, that people are supposed to be adjusting it. So you can fill in whatever you have available, or send it over to every partner that has been involved and see what they can fill in, whatever is available, or delete parts, add parts, whatever you need. So we decided to have it as a Word document, as a very simple thing, to basically record only the most essential information, I would say, on the process, resources, data, analysis undertaken, decisions taken, of course, and actors involved in the formulation process. But as I said, it's really not important that everything is there. It's just a tool that gives many options what can be tracked. I think what is important is that those implementing partners helping you with the NDC, or those partners nationally involved in the process that hand over any data, are tracked somewhere, so that we understand what data was used, where it was coming from, and then we can probably find it again next time, and we can do the modeling in a way that it's actually consistent all the time. Yeah, I think we skipped the development process because it's really not that interesting. We just have it in the slides if you need it. The rationale for updating it now is, of course, the climate negotiations have moved forward, and a lot of decisions are relevant here. I'm not going to go into all of this, I would call it letter soup, but that's kind of what the UNFCCC has produced since then, which, of course, the NDCs need to respond to, but also additional topics like loss and damage, some want covered, so better track that in the handover as well. The scope of analysis has, of course, changed a bit in response to the global stock take, but also in response to things like the global goal on adaptation. And then there is the whole decision on the enhanced transparency framework, which has several reporting requirements that are also informed by the same things as the NDC and need to respond to those. And finally, of course, it's relevant for next steps in the process between NDCs, namely its implementation and the NDC implementation plan, which is also a new process in many senses because countries haven't thought about it too much after the first NDC in a systematic way. Yeah, you can basically download it at the PADPA website or at our website. It's basically a Word format tool and accompanied by an Excel document that would help add all of the data that has been used. I would advise that the national focal point, who is also submitting the NDC, would trigger this process. So basically send it over to those organizations or those ministries who have been involved in the process and ask them to fill in whatever they can with reasonable amount of effort, of course. And then you can take it from there and see if maybe the ministry can solve final gap filling wherever some things have not been, some very important things have not been provided or trace those sometimes not very engaged implementing partners after the NDC submission to help inform this checklist and fill the gaps. It's really not supposed to be a lot of effort. It's just supposed to be solving the data consistency problem in essence. And with that, I guess I would hand over to Abhishek to guide you through the actual overview of the tool itself. And thank you so far. Abhishek, I will stop sharing and hand over to you.
Thank you, Ian. Just a minute. Hello, everyone. I'm Abhishek Yadav. I'm the Climate and Energy Policy Analyst at Climate Analytics and also the Deputy Director of the South Asia Office. So today, I'm going to take you through the NDC Handover Checklist update and its different components. As Jan said, the checklist is intended as a flexible, customizable document, so that it builds a progression of information on like where the NDC related data and analysis are located on different aspects, and then what were the different considerations that went into it. As you can see on the screen, the first part of the checklist deals with documenting who were the actual contributors to the checklist. So it gives institution, name, contact details, and sections of the checklist that the individuals worked on or the institutions worked on. Then we come to the checklist on the NDC. There are some key information that we would like to see. For example, the country name and the NDC submission date, who were involved in the drafting and review of the NDC, what kind of information in regards to 2030 and 2035 targets are given. For example, in the 2030, the option would be some might have just the same targets as the previous NDC, or some countries might have chosen to update the 2030 information. Other things in the key information, the other thing is the main inputs that went into the NDC 3.0. For example, the stocktake process, different policies that were analyzed, and different studies that were conducted to formulate the NDC. Then we go into more scoping of the NDC. How was the overall scope of the NDC determined? the checklist provides a place to enter information on national lead institution. Some countries, this might be Ministry of Forest and Environment, most likely, and the responsibilities of the lead institution. What was the scope of enhancement? For example, it might be something to do with mitigation. For example, if the number of sectors included were increased, or more gases were included, or just the targets, the ambition on the targets was increased, and whether it was progress towards economy-wide targets, or it could be on the adaptation side, or the overall quality of the NDC. Similarly, what were the different guidance documents that were referred to? For example, it could be the global stocktake outcome, the NDC synthesis report, or the IPCC's sixth assessment report, or the fifth one. Or it could be the global goal on adaptation and any of the breakthrough agendas. Similarly, there's also a place for to input the limitations. For example, were there a lack of data in a specific sector, or was it difficult to set targets due to lack of implementation finance, or lack of capacity and technical constraints in specific sectors? Moving on, there would be there's also a place to enter information on the methodology, for example, a different process and components, example, the stakeholder consultations, energy and non-energy modeling, policy analysis, finance strategy, and things like that. Similarly, what was the timeline, and was the time given sufficient to for the NDC 3.0? And then on the technical and financial side, what were the different analyses that were conducted? For example, was there a stock take of previous NDCs? Was there a policy analysis that helped to develop the emissions pathways? Was just transition aspect considered, or was an analysis performed on gender equality, disability, social inclusion? And then also the costing parts and the cost benefit analysis, or looking at co-impacts that might arise due to different targets. And then also on the adaptation side, looking at different climate risks and different adaptation measures, and then also maybe limit to adaptation, and looking at loss and damage assessments and assessments on financing, and also whether the NDC has conditional and unconditional aspects, and does it consider Article 6 and the temperature goal. Especially, you can see on the screen the global emission reductions that are consistent with the 1.5-degree pathway, and then what would be a country's fair contribution towards this. The third one is on the external support received on NDC formulation itself. What were the different support requested and the channel used to source or even request for support, different financial needs and different funders, and whether the finance was sufficient, what were the different support areas, and then types of support received. Example, on the assessments I was talking about earlier, different consultations, capacity building, and then what was the actual support provided against the support requested by different partners? Were there any overlaps, and how were synergies achieved? Then also details on different capacity building needs expressed, and the capacity of partners, and the overall lessons learned from the support. And then the checklist comes to the overall coordination of the NDC formulation. You can enter, the country can enter information on whether there were well-defined coordination mechanisms, who was the main coordinator institution, was the coordination process regular, and what was the frequency of coordination. How much resources were allocated for coordination, who were the different participating organizations, and who was providing coordination assistance overall, and then what were the different lessons learned on coordination. On the fifth section, we look at stakeholder engagement. Countries can enter information on different types of national stakeholders that were consulted, and what were their roles and responsibilities, what were the key advice for the next stakeholder process for the next cycle of NDCs. In the sixth section, we look at mitigation and modeling of greenhouse gas projections. What was the software used, which sectors were included, and who were the modelers? What was the emissions base year? What was the baseline coming up to the current period? And then what were the different socioeconomic assumptions, such as GDP and population and growth factors and things like that. Then what was was there a baseline inventory available in different documents? For example, the third national communication, or the BTR, which is the biennial transparency report. What was the source of different data that was used for modeling? Was the data sufficient for generating different mitigation pathways? And then also the details on those pathways and the reasoning for going from multiple alternatives and choosing a specific target. And then what were the pathway assumptions for different mitigation pathways? What was the time frame and the model? Where is the model stored and who can access it? And then overall, what were the challenges from the modeling cycle? And the mitigation section also has a data handover sheet where you can enter quantitative targets by different IPCC sectors, and then give more information on the data location, assumptions, and methodology. And then other information, including information on gases, and an example has been included for ease. And then the main objective of the handover sheet is to sort of build a progression of this information over the previous cycles and the upcoming cycles. And then in the seventh section, we look more closely into adaptation, and then what were the different approaches to coming up with the adaptation component of the NDC. For example, was there an existing national adaptation strategy or plan? What were other relevant policies and plans in the adaptation space? And was there an assessment undertaken for adaptation? For example, it could be a risk assessment of different climate risks that you can see on the screen, or it could be a hazard mapping. Then where did this assessment data come from, and where it is stored, and who has access, and then what were the lessons learned. Then the checklist has a section on inputting information on relevant parallel processes. that were ongoing, and then the alignment with such processes, for example, the National Adaptation Plan, the long-term low emissions development strategy, and then other national level or subnational level energy strategies that the government might be developing or has already developed, and then aligning the NDC, was it considered or not? And then also under the enhanced transparency framework, where the progress tracking of NDC takes place. So, so are there any reports on that track? Are there any national reports that track progress towards the ETF, for example, the BTR, the BUR, and the BR that Jan also touched upon earlier, and then also where any tools like the NDC implementation plan for overall or for sector specific were used for mainstreaming the NDC into the national processes, for example, the national budget and planning process and things like that. So the NDC can really be mainstreamed into action. Then we ask for information on the drafting of NDC in the checklist. For example, what are the different documents were referred to set up the structure, overall structure of the NDC. For example, the ICTU, the information on clarity, transparency, and understanding table, or was it based on some country priorities? Some countries might prioritize to include, for example, adaptation, and some might not. And then also different IPCC guidelines that could help with the structuring of, for example, the mitigation sectors. Then information, it has a place to input information on stakeholder feedback, on the NDC, whether it was made available online for the public or through some other channels. What were the languages the draft NDC was made available? And was the feedback incorporated, and was the NDC revised based on this feedback? And finally, it asks for information on the approval and submission of NDCs. For example, the national NDC validation process, who was the national approval, which was the national approval body, what went well during approval, and maybe things that didn't go that well, and what were the lessons learned and recommendations for improving the approval process so that the NDC can be submitted and it can be listed in the NDC registry. So I think in my closing words, I would just like to say that the handover checklist is a helpful tool that is flexible and customizable. And then the main aim of the NDC checklist is to sort of build a progression of information over NDC cycles, so that even when some people leave and new people come in to work on the NDC at the partners and at the national focal institutions, and there is a place where the information from previous NDC analysis and formulation has been cataloged. Thank you. With that, I hand over to Fran.
Yes, thank you, Abhishek, and thank you, Jan, very much for the really informative presentations and to go over some of the key components of what's in the checklist. So now we're going to move into the part of the session where we're going to open the floor for questions, reflections. It's a really great opportunity to engage both with the presenters, but also with you as fellow participants, as I imagine many people are in the midst of supporting NDC 3.0 processes. And so especially if you are working on an NDC or you've been involved in knowledge management processes, we already have a question in the Q&A. So just a reminder from Sarah in the beginning, there's the question and answer section where we can either respond in writing or respond live. And Jan, we have a first question, which I think probably the best place to send to you. So the question is from Gopal. It's GHG emission data is very important for NDCs, but is also very hard to calculate. So is it possible to provide a link for learning according to IPCC GHG emissions? And so over to you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, the link alone is easy. We can send you an email on that if you give us contact data. Basically, the IPCC has all of the training and all of the manuals on their website. It's a bit difficult to find sometimes, but it's actually very comprehensive. And I guess you are aware of that, because when you say it's very difficult to, or very hard to calculate, that's indeed true. And if you look at their guidance, you will probably have to focus on certain sectors, because the expertise required to use this across all sectors is hard to come by. Not many people have that. Maybe you do, but most people would have difficulty looking into all of the sector guidelines and to understand what they are talking about. There are a number of training sessions out there that would also help with this. But it depends on how deep you want to go into the actual modeling work, if it's really a useful investment of time to try getting into all sectors again. So I would recommend to focus. There's good guidance from the likes of Irina, also from GIZ, I think, on how to do for some of the sectors like energy, transport. I think waste is very difficult too. There's very good guidance also from the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, on how to do it for agriculture. So that's one. And the other part is there are tools out there that help and make it much easier, because they already ingrain all of the IPCC guidelines and all of the methodological background, and you just need to input the data. For instance, for the agricultural sector, a very simplistic but very, for that reason, useful one, it would be FAO Exact, which is basically doing for any interventions you would want, a direct calculation of emission reductions based on the input data that you give. For instance, like I reduce livestock of this type by that many over that period. Simple example. Or I would change my rice management technique to use so and so much less water. So there are tools like that can help as well. Yeah, I'm happy to engage in a discussion on email. Mine is in the slides here to help you out further if you're interested. Thanks.
Great,
And
Jan. And if you want, please also feel free to drop some links in either the Q&A or in the chat, if they can jump into some of those that you mentioned. Abhishek, did you want to add anything here?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Fran. Yeah, I think Jan covered most of it, but it is important to understand that greenhouse gas emissions modeling can be very complex, and it needs a lot of time to actually build the building blocks of your emissions inventory, and then going further to build in mitigation pathways. So I think it's good to follow IPCC guidelines where available, and then also look at up and coming research to see like some sectors that might not be well represented in the IPCC guidelines. What are the different up and coming research in that specific sector? And I think it's always good on the energy side to look at the energy balance that the country might be recording, and then use of software like Leap or others can sort of help to organize the information better so that you can actually build pathways and do those calculations. Thanks.
Thanks, Abhishek. I'm going to jump to the hand up. Hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Sekou. If you're able to unmute. Not yet.
Voilà, bonsoir à tous et à toutes. Je suis Sékou Fodé Camara de la Guinée, c'est bien prononcé, et point focal de la contribution déterminée au niveau national, CDN. Et j'informe déjà que nous sommes dans le processus de révision de la CDN, dans un premier temps avec l'évaluation de l'état des lieux de la mise en œuvre de la CDN. Et ce rapport est disponible avec des résultats vraiment tangibles. Et merci pour le partage de l'outil de vérification. Mais ma préoccupation se trouve à deux niveaux. Premièrement, est-ce que cet outil qui a été présenté, et c'est possible de l'avoir en version française pour nous permettre de vérifier et avec tous ces contours qui ont été développés, ça c'est un premier aspect. Un deuxième aspect, oui, la présentation, nous l'avons suivie avec intérêt, mais c'est de savoir est-ce qu'il y a aujourd'hui une approche pour permettre, comme on appelle, à tous ces participants de pouvoir mieux s'approprier de l'outil parce que cet outil aussi, c'est un outil qui est essentiel et c'est un outil qui est très, très important dans le processus, comme on appelle, de mise en œuvre de l'accord de Paris. Merci beaucoup.
Great. Thank you very much for your question. And maybe I'll first say, yes, it is available in French. We have it in Spanish, Portuguese, French, English, Russian, and Jan, have I missed one? No, that's it. Yes. And so it's available on the links that will be sent around afterwards in all of those languages. The one thing that will be updated this week will be the attached Excel sheets that go essentially with the data handover, the database, etc. And Jan, would you want to jump in on the second question around how to help build an understanding better of the tool?
Yeah, I mean, I might want to ask back what exactly you need to have more understanding, deeper understanding of, and maybe we can answer right here. I would just on a general level say that there are these many sections in there that are useful. I would say especially the number 6 on data transfer and modeling, as well as the Excel sheet that accompanies it. They would be the most relevant part if you want to make sure you can, over time, compare your NDCs. And that is something that you definitely want to be able to, I would think. The process for that is basically if the ministry hires somebody like a university or a partner like us to help them with the modeling, they should also reach out to that organization or person to fill in that checklist part. And that should be simple for them because that is information they would need to have in order to help develop the NDC to begin with. And they shouldn't have a reason not to share with the ministry they've been doing the work for. There is no mandatory section in this in general. So whatever data may not be available can just be left out. It's going to be helpful to have a track record of who's been involved and what assumptions they have been making and what model have been produced. So these basics you can always answer. And with that, you can always start filling the gaps. Yeah, but I think in terms of understanding the tool, it's just a Word document where you fill in this information. And we have tried very hard to compile a succinct but complete list of what is useful to develop this. But it's all flexible and there is not much magic behind it. It's a Word tool. So everybody can use it for free and can change it as they like. The main point about this tool really is to trace the process over time and especially the data. Because when you don't do that, as I mentioned before, you cannot actually compare NDCs. And if you cannot compare NDCs because you lack the data assumptions used for the last one, you cannot show your progression of ambition over time.
Thanks, Jan. And Sekou, maybe that's something that Jan can follow up bilaterally after the session to support on any additional information that you need, or through our colleagues who are based in Climate Analytics Africa office as well in Togo. They might also be able to assist. So we have 3 other questions in the Q&A at the moment. One, just a follow-up from Gopal. Jan, any of the sources that you mentioned, he'd appreciate to receive. So over to Guna. How can the updated NDC Handover Checklist keep record of the work, ideas, and lessons from the private sector, like Recon, so that future NDC updates can build on them and aim higher? Abhishek or Jan, do you want to take that? Abhishek, do you want to jump in?
Thanks, Fran. Thanks, Gunnar, for the question. I think the different stakeholders, right? The checklist is supposed to be filled in with different stakeholders. So it should be an inclusive process and similar to the NDC process itself. So while filling in the checklist, I think it would be good to have one united checklist, but different parts of the checklist where different organizations worked on can be filled in together with the government focal point, so that it covers aspects from the public sector and different line ministries, as well as from the private sector and other sectors. So I think to sum it up, it's good for private sector to also support in filling out the handover checklist, but it is recommended that you fill it out together with the focal point, so that all the information on different sectors can be collected in one unified checklist.
Awesome. Thanks, Jan. Abhishek, Jan, is there anything else that you'd like to add to that?
No, I think that's a pretty complete answer,
All
actually.
right. Then I might kick it straight to you for the next question. The question is, I would like to ask how the data handover sheet links with the common tabular formats in the BTR. Difficult question.
Yeah, that's a good one. It's actually a good idea to format it in a way that it can basically be copied over, but we try to keep it a bit more simple. You see, for the BTR, you need a host of information that is actually more detailed than what we currently have in the checklist in terms of the data outcomes. So you would need to have all of the findings and results. That's doable, but that's already part of what goes into the NDC, so it's there and can be retrieved from there to some extent. But we need to look at it again and see if it's possible to actually format the whole thing in a way that we can basically use the Excel that we have as accompanying document to dump it into the BTR so that it's already basically done. I think that is a good next step for us to move this into something that is even more useful. And then I would have to hope that the BTR format isn't changed, because then I would have to change it every time.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Jan.
good idea.
All right, we have another question that came in. Thank you for the great presentation. So reflecting on your experience as supporting partners during the last NDC cycle, are there any specific processes or decisions that you wish had been better documented? And do you see a potential for a tool like this to support a reflective exercise, such as multi-stakeholder debriefs or workshops, and to help capture elements of the process, especially those that are harder to document, like consultations or modeling? It's a mouthful.
Yeah, it's a long list, actually. Maybe starting to pick it up in pieces. the specific processes or decisions. We have had problems sometimes to even figure out who was helping with developing the model for NDC targets. So that is one. And then we also had a problem with understanding which stakeholders had been consulted. That is important because if you have an NDC target, it's never going to go away. It's going to stay in the next NDC in one way or another. But if you do no longer know who said that target is okay, you will also have a hard time finding out who can help with achieving it, because that's normally the same person who understands what needs to be done in order to achieve a certain target. So that's the other one. And these two are the most critical, I think. For me, at least. Maybe Abhishek has more to add. And that is easy to document through the checklist. I also see potential, of course, for a tool like this for reflective exercises. And we are collecting a few things that have been problematic or could be improved, a few lessons learned in the tool. But I think there can be a more detailed discussion about that also based on the tool in the next rounds of NDCs. Because you see, the main problem we have is that the stakeholders who buy into a target at the moment usually are not going to be able to help with the next NDC, because many of them move on. And to learn what has been helpful in discussing targets and discussing NDCs with stakeholders involved is therefore requiring some institutional knowledge and some memory, like provided through the checklist as well, to understand how we can better negotiate what needs to be achieved. And negotiations are becoming tougher because we are trying to move towards net zero. So the first NDCs may have been about low-hanging fruits where every stakeholder wouldn't necessarily disagree. The second one was already a bit more difficult, but mostly focusing on single sectors like energy, where it's overall beneficial and there's no side effects, no negative consequences. But the next round will have to look at things like agriculture and waste as well, and industry. And their decisions are more complicated because there are winners and losers from making adjustments. And learning how to do this with stakeholders and who to talk to, who to even engage in that, who can help with that, is a very important thing, which I hope through tracking who has been involved in the past and what worked well might be smoothened as a process. Yeah, Abhishek, there's probably a few things more we can say to answer that, or try to answer that comprehensive question. Do you want to come in?
Thanks, Jan. I think there's always a better way to document things. Usually governments always come up, most of the time come up with some sort of assessment reports to explain different reasoning for different targets and how they were selected. And then this handover checklist is supposed to be something that they can quickly fill out, given they have the information already. I think, and for example, in Nepal, we used the checklist, and it was really helpful to look at it again in this cycle to see how we could even enhance the NDC, what could be different inputs that could go into it. And so it also informed sort of like what we want to do, what approach we want to take with the NDC 3. So I think it's a good tool. And then obviously there are always newer aspects coming in for different NDC cycles. And there will always be new updates to the checklist required, I imagine, as we move along to document those things. Thanks.
Thanks both. We have another question in here, and Jan, I think you're typing, you're going to answer that in typed form. Happy to take any other questions, either by hands up through the Q&A or in the chat. One of the things that it might be useful to hear, including from other implementing partners or support partners that are joining us is where and how you might have been experiencing institutional memory challenges in delivering work, and how you might have documented processes or decisions or data sources without a tool like the NDC Handover Checklist to allow for that to be passed on from cycle to cycle. If there are others in the room that would like to share their experience, we'd welcome that as well. Or maybe even Climate Analytics team, what have, prior to this handover checklist, Jan, I know that you've been engaged in supporting NDCs since they were INDCs. And so what was the process at that point in helping countries document what were some of the good standard practices prior to having something like a handover checklist?
Yeah, the second best thing, basically, at least in we always did that for sure. Many others too. And then the second best thing, of course, is to hand everything over. So everything we did in the process of that NDC, that is meeting reports with stakeholders, assessments of greenhouse gas emission reduction potential, adaptation plans, and also how we model the target, mostly back then in Excel actually, and with FAO database tools. Everything we ever did, we dumped on the government and gave them a document saying what it is. It's cumbersome and it's very difficult to find something in such a data dump. But if you're hard pressed to find some information, you might dig into it. And I know that many people did in the cases, for instance, Gambia, where we supported in that way. So it is useful too, but it is much more complicated than to find what you're looking for.
Yeah, especially if it's not in your standard practice for handover of back-end analysis. Abhishek, did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I think coming from the previous cycle, I think I already touched upon this a little bit on like how the checklist was helpful to us to sort of look at what was done before. And then, for example, this time we also had to work across different aspects of the Paris Agreement. For example, the LT-LEDs that was already there with a net zero commitment, and the National Adaptation Plan. And so it was really important for us to sync up with those, especially on the mitigation side, sync up with the work that was done previously by a different group of partners. And having access to that data was really helpful for us to align everything. And Nepal is also preparing its first BTR, the biannual transparency report, to track its second NDC and also the maybe aspects of its first one. So I think it was really helpful that a lot of the data was handed over and with the ministry, and then we could, as we come in, different partners come in, and there might be changes to the focal point by the time we go from one process to another, but there's a place where the data has been handed over to the ministry, and then we can look at what previous teams did with different processes and align with that.
Thanks both. All right, we don't have any other questions in the Q&A or in the chat. I'm going to add a couple of links into the webinar chat that we can then also send out. But you'll find our contact information in the slides that will be sent out and the information that will be shared by the NDC Partnership support unit subsequent to the webinar. And of course, please feel free to reach out to us, on any questions on the checklist or otherwise. We're happy to assist in that. Jan and Abhishek, I'm going to hand over to you for any kind of closing remarks. And maybe Abhishek, just quickly, 30 seconds, a minute on what you feel like are some of the key next steps that are important out while countries are finalizing their NDC 3.0. And then Jan, it'll be over to you for closing remarks.
Thanks, Fran. Yeah, as countries are finalizing their NDC, I think it's important to think about different guidance that has in the international and regional space. For example, the GST outcome, how the NDC has been informed by the GST outcome is really important. Then also alignment with the 1.5-degree pathway, and looking at what should be the fair share of any country towards that global goal. And then also, I think the stakeholders part, and not to forget that stakeholders are an important part of the NDC process, and it definitely helps to involve them for an NDC that can be owned by the country in different sectors, and that can be ambitious as well as actionable. Thanks.
Thanks, Abhishek. Jan.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks everyone for attending, and thanks for considering. I see there is interest, and I don't probably need to pitch again why it's important. I believe that over time, when we are moving closer towards mid-century long-term strategy targets that need to be achieved, this whole process might actually come up with a solution that is more robustly useful across all of the transparency and reporting mechanisms that we have. Until that is the case, we will be working on an improvement for the checklist to also inform that more easily. I'll take that away from here. That would be useful. I would also mention that a lot of this transparency work that is required to see where we are towards achieving net zero at the moment globally, a lot of this transparency and reporting work reuses the same data as we use for developing the NDCs anyways. So even if there is no direct input into any of these reports right now, all of the work that has been done to fill these reports and submit them would greatly benefit from having a track record of how the NDC was developed, where the data is housed, and even what the data looks like, probably. It would make it much easier. And the main thing is also it would make it consistent. So we would no longer end up with disagreeing national reports. And that is currently sometimes the case, that we have even between one and another year, different targets brought forward in a national communication to the UNFCCC and then in an NDC, or the other way around. And not different in the sense that they are more ambitious or less ambitious, but different in the sense that they even covered sectors which haven't been covered before, or lose them, which have been covered before. So these problems need not be there, and it's easy to solve them with the proper track record of what has been done. I would also reiterate, it is supposed to be a light lift, and the effort doesn't necessarily sit on the national focal points and the countries, but it's important that the national focal point is involved and is privy to the final result of this, so that they can share it in the future when they are involved again in the next round of NDC development. And then finally, it's also a little bit of self-interest, because I am not really too happy having to reach out to all of the line ministry data experts every 5 years, trying to understand who's having any sort of information that I'm looking for. And it takes a very long time sometimes. Time that is also better spent with these data experts looking into actual data, rather than trying to share it with me in any sense of in any sort of format. So we would also, of course, while it helps us to make the process easier to access data to begin with, we would also free capacity of those people who are housing the data, because they can then easily share and they are easily found, whatever has been done before, which is currently also difficult. So they have to scramble every time to make sure they find the right information. Once we know where the information actually is, also these people can quickly access it. So there are many benefits. There's little effort required. It's also fully flexible. If things that are in this checklist do not look like they are most critical or not available, you can just leave them blank. And it's a tool that is also easy to adjust. If you find things are missing, you can add them. And I wish that people do that and use this as their own kind of source of recording in whichever way they see useful for themselves and their circumstances, but would really appreciate if it's being used, because if NDCs are not consistent and not comparable over time, they are not useful. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jan, and thanks everybody for joining. Abhishek, Jan, thank you, and thanks to the NDC Partnership for hosting today. And please do feel free, as mentioned, to get in touch with us for any further information. Thanks a lot. Take care.